Is the conviction of Hunter Biden just under libertarian principles? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that y'all know brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's great to be with you and, of course, our viewers and listeners who are always very kind to stop by and listen to what we have to say.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. And well, Richard, it's been in the news, a lot of legal stuff, but I thought particularly we ought to address one of the big legal cases in the country today. That's the federal criminal prosecution of Hunter Biden, the son of President Biden. Uh, he was convicted in a federal district court of gun related charges, specifically that when he went into a gun store, he filed false statements to an application there, and he responded to questions from the dealer there that he was not a drug user. And a jury convicted him of that offense. You lied. You did. You were a drug user, and the law says that if you lie on these applications in that respect, you're going to be convicted and prosecuted, which they did. And then also he purchased the gun, and so he violated a gun control law that prohibits drug users from owning guns. So he's obviously going to appeal. We don't know what his sentence is. The likelihood is that he's going to get probation, something like that, because of the nature of the offense. The commentators are pointing out that most people are not even prosecuted for this crime. It's kind of like a discretionary prosecution, that prosecutors bring it only mostly when a crime has been committed, like a violent crime or something with the gun. Then they'll use this, but otherwise it's sort of like a standby criminal offense. But in this case, they decided to bring it for whatever reason. So from my perspective, Richard, it just seems to me to be a totally improper prosecution and conviction under libertarian principles. For one thing, I don't see why a person who's a drug user should not be entitled to the benefits of the protections of the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. I don't see an exception there that says, shall not be infringed unless you're a drug user, unless you're a drug possessor. Why shouldn't drug users have the same right to defend themselves as anybody else? And if we're going to go there, then why not alcohol users or alcoholics? I mean, seems to me that there's a lot of violent crimes that are committed by alcoholics and alcohol users that even if they're not alcoholics, they get drunk and they use a gun. And why not protect the society from those people too, except for the fact that alcohol is a little bit more popular drug than the marijuana or other drugs. So I think this whole thing is just a bogus prosecution. What do you think?
Well, I think that to pick up on kind of a strand you mentioned is that if we were to follow through with this, uh, a, a frequently reported form of violence nowadays are stabbings. In Europe, just recently in China, against three American professors from some Ohio college, episodes here in the United States, either just violent ones for a criminal or mental problem or something having to do with some ideological issue. People have been stabbing others, some just injuring them, some causing fatalities. Why wouldn't you just say that, you can't own a hammer or a knife of a blade of a certain length unless you're off alcohol, you're off drugs, you can be argued to be having proper mental faculties in a reasonable use of a knife or a hammer. That would be just ludicrous. The fact is that people own knives and hammers, and some use them as weapons, but most don't. And the presumption is that unless a crime is committed with the object, right? And I'm using a generic term, an object, there's no crime committed, whether the person owning and wielding the hammer or the knife around their house or outside their house or in whatever setting, or even just carrying it, is drunk or not. Unless a crime is committed, there's no reason for legal recourse. I see no reason along the lines that you're suggesting uh, that the same thing should apply to firearms. Uh, for example, here in South Carolina, they recently passed state legislation that allows open carry. Now, I've not been seeing many people on the streets of the Charleston area, with their, Western six-shooter on their hip, by golly, or walking around the street twirling it like in those Western movies. I haven't seen any of that. It would be cute, though. I haven't seen any of those. But the fact is that, the law is saying that a person can have these for his divine sense of self-defense. And even if you can carry a weapon publicly like that, that's a word of warning to those who might think of committing a crime against you. It's a defense mechanism, if you will. Holy moly, this guy is armed, and if I attack him, I might be in an undesirable situation as he's fighting back. Um, so I don't think that unless a crime is committed, the ownership of such an item should be considered a potential criminal offense, whether one is on alcohol or drugs or any other such thing. I mean, you could talk about driving an automobile. I think it's unwise, and you should try to persuade someone not to drive when they're under the influence of alcohol. But the fact is that unless the person hits another vehicle or a pedestrian, no crime has been committed. I consider it unwise. Now, let me make a distinction, however, if I can just follow with this a bit, Jacob. I think you'd agree with this, is that in the private sector, the owner of the property can determine the conditions under which others may enter his property and have some use of them. For example, if someone owns a bar or a restaurant where alcohol is served, and they have a public notice that they're open for business to the general public, but we prohibit from customers bringing their firearms in, or a knife attached to their belt or something. That's just a matter of private free association. You either you follow the rules of the restaurant owner, or you go eat someplace else. Um, if we were in a real libertarian society, in which roads were private, that would apply to driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs. The road provider would set the rules for access, which you're paying a fee. And just as now in businesses, you still say no service without shoes or a shirt, those signs are still sometimes around. You could easily say the same thing, that we prohibit the use of our roads or entering our bar or restaurant, except those who are under the influence of this. And if I can give one more actual concrete example of this, I don't know how many of our viewers and listeners have been to Amsterdam in the Netherlands and Holland, but many, if not most, drugs, narcotics are illegal there. Certainly from marijuana to cocaine and heroin, they have their own legal rules, which is it never matter, but you can basically buy and sell drugs there. But if you walk around the streets of Amsterdam and various areas for residents as well as tourists, what you will see is signs in the restaurant windows. This is a drug-free environment. And that's the same thing as saying no service without a shirt and shoes. That's the choice, because they clearly have a clientele who wants to feel in a safer way than potential druggies, just whether they act weird or just seem to be strange sitting next to you. And it seems that the private sector would set up its own rules, procedures, and circumstances to minimize some of that, which some members of the general public might feel uncomfortable with in interacting in a market setting. Just as you set up your own rules when someone comes to your house, right? You invite people, but you say, well, please, no smoking, blah, 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 in my house. So it seems that the private sector, if in a true free society, would find its own diverse and plurality of ways to handle these situations without the state using its usual one-size-fits-all straitjacket of imposing one conception of what's right or wrong on everyone, when it is not a criminal act in itself.
Well, there's already that's already taking place. Like here in Virginia, we have concealed carry.
Mhm.
Um, and so you can go wherever you want with a concealed weapon, unless the private institution says no guns are allowed.
Mhm.
And like our movie theaters around here where I live, they have a sign here, no firearms, which I think is an absolutely ludicrous policy because the person that's going to do some mass killing in that theater is not going to give a hoot about that sign.
Mhm.
And he's going to go in there and start shooting up. So what really the policy does is it denies everybody with a concealed carry permit to defend himself in there. And the thing about a concealed carry is that you don't have to be carrying the weapon yourself. You may feel like, hey, I don't feel competent with guns. I don't feel comfortable with guns. But you got 2 or 3 people in there that know how to use guns. They're there protecting you. They're keeping you safe by knocking out the guy that's the mass killer. But as you point out, this is how a free society works. They got a right to make these policies. They may be bad policies, but then you don't have to go to that movie theater either. Now let me take this thing to another level though on the on this thing that Biden got convicted of. You know, why in the world should the federal government be involved even with these background checks? I mean, what business is it of government to determine who's entitled to get a weapon or not? Because the thing about these background checks is as soon as you start filling out the form, the government knows who has the guns. And that's one of the first steps to a full-fledged tyrannical society. That in a major crisis, when they need to round up guns, this is what has gone on throughout history. They need to confiscate the guns first. I mean, the British understood that. That was what Concord was all about. Is that um, they got to go in there and confiscate the guns, and then people become obedient, and the guns know this. So as soon as they start doing these background checks and you're filling out forms, they know who's buying the guns. Now, I think they claim that they destroy these records after a certain period of time, but come on. I mean, do you really think they're doing that? I'm very doubtful of that. But again, what business do they have even knowing who has guns? I say that government has no role in this whatsoever. And then there's also the licensing of these gun dealers. Why is the federal government granting licenses? Where in the Constitution does it grant them the power to give official permission to who can sell guns and who can't sell guns? And then going back to the original point, that let's say a person does smoke marijuana. Now that's one of the controlled, what is it, Schedule 1 substances of the federal government. It's in the same category as heroin and cocaine. There's a lot of people that smoke dope in this country, Richard, and take marijuana edibles and stuff. You're telling me that they are prohibited to have a gun to protect themselves? I mean, there's a lot of instances where they're not on drugs. They're sitting in the privacy of their own home, and somebody starts breaking in the middle of the night, and because they smoke dope, let's say on weekends or whenever, they can't protect themselves. It's a felony to have a gun. I mean, that to me is absolutely outrageous, and I'm willing to bet that there's a lot of people that smoke marijuana or ingest marijuana that own guns. Now, there was an interesting commentary by a lawyer in the mainstream press. I forget which paper, New York Times, Washington Post, whatever. He was saying, well, the problem is not the jury here. The jury found Biden guilty because he did technically violate the law, and they found it beyond a reasonable doubt. And he says the problem's with the prosecutor. He says the prosecutor should have exercised discretion and not prosecuted here. But you see, that's the real value of a highly regulated society, is that it lets the state have this hammer over everybody that you better behave or we're going to come after you with our highly regulated society. And I remember Ayn Rand writing about this in Atlas Shrugged, where she said to some statist, I forget his name, that hey, we have all these rules and regulations. We want you to break the laws because now we have this hammer over you that if you get out of line, we can come and get you. And so I think this lawyer is totally off base, that the notion that prosecutors can have this grab bag of possible crimes to go after whoever they want. But meanwhile, leave most people alone. But if you get out of line, we're going to come after you. That's horrendous. That's totally contrary to the principles of a free society, where the government can come after you on a discretionary basis just by having this grab bag of crimes to go after you. And finally, again, I would reemphasize that why not alcohol? You know, how many people drink alcohol that have guns in their house to protect themselves, which I think they have an absolute right to do, but that's no different from marijuana or any other drug usage.
This issue of discretion is important, particularly in this context, is that one of the articles in the papers that I saw was that pointing out that this type of incident in which a person may have filed a false document concerning having taken drugs, this Hunter Biden is not a unique case, and that it's either ignored or the person gets a slap on the wrist or something minor. The discretion has risen precisely because of who Hunter Biden is. They had to do this, and they had to be demanding, a conviction with a potentially heavy punishment, precisely because, we're having these trials against Trump, unless we do it to someone who's even the president's son, then we're seeming biased. We seem politically, ideologically driven. So in a sense, Hunter Biden has been a victim of the political establishment's wanting to seem even-handed, given the trials being made against Trump. So he's like caught in the middle of a political game. And I have no interest in Hunter Biden. He might be a sleazy guy. Everything I read, he's had his own problems, fine, but in a sense, he's a political pawn of the very process going on right now.
Absolutely. But it is kind of amusing though that his father, President Biden, is sort of getting hoisted on his own petard here. I mean, he's obviously very distraught over what's happening to his son. But Biden has been one of the biggest advancers of gun control and the drug
Yeah,
war. And how
absolutely.
many people has he put away as president in his Justice Department as part of the drug war? So here it's kind of poetic justice that his son is getting hoisted on this petard of drug laws and gun control.
Absolutely. But this just all reinforces the other point that reinforces that why is there a Second Amendment on the right to own and bear and use arms in certainly in self-defense? It's not just to secure you against the dangers and threats of private criminals, which of course is always a concern. Someone breaks in your house to burglarize or just do you physical harm, having some means of defending you and your family. Ultimately, and the founding fathers understood this, is the right to bear arms is important to secure the citizenry against the potential tyranny of the government itself. How easy the servant can abuse its power to become a master that can be cruel and brutal in the process. And the idea that the government, state and certainly as federal, as you were saying, is going to keep these records. Who owns the gun? How many firearms do they have? Where is the location, right? You give it an address on the form. Is a means of the government to protect themselves from the ability of the citizenry to protect their own liberty if and when a circumstance arose, obviously in an extreme situation in which there was no alternative or recourse other than to defend oneself against political power directly.
I think that is a point that is really, really, it needs to be emphasized over and over again. It's a point that the right wing, the conservatives have lost. They'll always talk about gun control, about, you have a right to shoot deer with your AR-15, or you have a right to defend yourself from a criminal, both of which are true. But the real point is that gun ownership is an insurance policy. And every government official that even thinks about tyranny, imposing tyranny or more tyranny, has to know that people have the ability to resist. That if people don't have the ability to resist, then the temptation to cross the line and do bad things to them increases. And I know that there's people saying, "Oh, well, that would never happen here in the United States." Are you kidding me? I mean, look at the kind of system we live under, the national security state type of system. Look at the regimes they've put into power in other countries, like the Pinochet regime that rounded up 60,000 people, innocent people, started killing them, raping them, or torturing them, all with the full support of the national security state here. And it's not a big leap to go from installing and supporting a brutal right-wing regime or a left-wing regime or whatever overseas to saying, well, there may come a day when we may have to do the same thing here at home. And if it's been said that if a disarmed society is an obedient society, if you don't have the means of resistance, then you become compliant. You start saying yes, sir. And whenever they start doing things, one of the most stark examples of this phenomenon occurred in the movie with Mel Gibson. What was it called? It escapes me, where he's resisting the tyranny of the Scottish. He's in Scotland.
Oh, yes. Braveheart.
Braveheart. So there's that scene where on the wedding night where this guy marries this woman, and these guys come over with the soldiers, and they've got all their swords and stuff, and the Lord says, under the right of prima noctor, I have the right to sleep with your wife on her wedding night. And they had all the swords. The husband wanting to resist, and his wife stops him and says, "You're going to be dead," essentially. And so she rides off and to be raped by this jerk. But that's the whole idea of weapon control. It was sword control back then. They didn't have guns. But if you don't have the means to resist this type of thing, bad things are going to be done to you by the state.
Yeah, I should just say is that, well, that seems to be something used for dramatic effect in a movie. In fact, historically, there were parts of Europe where princes and lords of the manor had that authority under tradition. And so it was not just something in a movie. It was a practice in certain parts of Europe and obviously hundreds of years ago.
Yeah. Well, as you point out, the main idea is this of gun ownership is the right to resist tyranny. So the another interesting aspect of this, Richard, is Biden says, "Well, I won't pardon my son." Well, I think his son deserves a pardon. I mean, if there was ever a case that deserved a pardon, I mean, to me, this is it. But he's boxed in because it looks so bad that he's pardoning his son. But an interesting twist to this is that they asked his press secretary or somebody's administration that, what about commutation? And which is different from pardon. that, well, I can't answer. The answer was, I can't answer that. I don't know what the president's position is on that. So a commutation, I think, would say, well, whatever time he is serving will be commuted to what time served. And so I think Biden may be reserving the option of the commutation. I'm not sure of that. He may have meant to include that in pardon, but uh, again, he's being hoisted on his own petard here on this pardon power. I
I
think he
would
really
not be
should pardon.
surprised if Biden loses the election to Trump. That, as is often the case, a day or two before a president leaves office, he signs all those pardon documents, pardoning this guy, that guy, some other guy. And we all know that occasionally it's, a classic example of some donor or buddy of the president or some particularly interest that has aroused his concern that the day before he leaves the White House, he either commutes the sentence or pardons Hunter. It would not surprise me.
I would be aghast if he didn't. Now, but what's interesting also is his lawyer did announce they were going to appeal, and it would just be fantastic if they appeal under the Second Amendment and get this whole thing knocked out and declared unconstitutional, that drug users have just as much right to defend themselves as everybody else. That would be another interesting aspect of this case.
So one of the unintended consequences of the Hunter Biden case would be that it would be at least partial blow for the rationale and defense of the Second Amendment.
Exactly. That would be fantastic. All right. On that note, Richard, we'll wrap it up. Enjoy the conversation as always. thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your great support of the Future of Freedom Foundation. And Richard, I look forward to seeing you next week.
Until next time.